March 17, 1945. A Saturday morning at Camp Harrison, Pennsylvania, Mechthild Zimmermann woke to an unfamiliar sound drifting through the barracks window. Laughter. American laughter, mixed with the clatter of dishes and the sizzle of something cooking. She sat up on her thin mattress, her breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. Around her, 43 other German women stirred beneath their gray wool blankets, their faces still marked by the exhaustion of captivity. The smell hit her next, rich, sweet, buttery. Nothing like the thin porridge or stale bread they had been eating since their capture 3 months earlier. Mechthild's stomach clenched with hunger she had learned to ignore. Beside her, 21-year-old Adelheid Krauss pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "What are they cooking?" Adelheid whispered in German, her voice tight with something between hope and fear. "It smells like before the war." Mechthild joined her at the window. Through the frosted pane, she could see American guards moving between buildings, their postures relaxed in a way that seemed impossible for soldiers. One of them, a young private she had learned was named Alvin Hoffmeyer, carried a large covered pan toward the mess hall. Steam rose from beneath the lid, and even from this distance, the aroma made her mouth water. They had been told many things about Americans during the war, that they were cruel and wasteful, that they hoarded resources while the rest of the world starved, that they cared nothing for prisoners, especially German prisoners. Yet in 3 months at this camp, Mechthild had seen none of that cruelty. Instead, she had witnessed something that confused her more than hatred ever could have. Indifference mixed with occasional unexpected kindness. Captain Helen Waverly, the officer in charge of their section, had never raised her voice. Sergeant Russell Thorne, who supervised their daily work assignments, had once given Frida Lehmann an extra blanket when she was shivering with fever. These small gestures contradicted everything Mechthild had been taught about the enemy. But this morning felt different. The entire camp buzzed with unusual energy. American soldiers who normally looked tired and homesick now moved with purpose and something that looked almost like excitement. Through the thin walls of the barracks, Mechthild could hear other prisoners whispering, speculating, wondering what was happening. A sharp knock on the door silenced their conversations. Private Hoffmeyer stood in the doorway, his young face serious but not unkind. He was barely older than Adelheid, with sandy hair and the broad shoulders of someone who had grown up doing farm work. "Breakfast assembly in 20 minutes, he announced in careful, accented German that he had been practicing. "Captain Waverly asks that everyone attend." He paused, then added something that made Mechthild's heart skip. "It's Saturday. We have special breakfast." The door closed, leaving 44 German women staring at each other in confused silence, none of them understanding that this ordinary Saturday morning would change everything they believed about their enemies, their future, and themselves. December 10th, 1944. 3 months earlier. The transport ship had taken 11 days to cross the Atlantic from Southampton to New York Harbor. Mechthild Zimmermann stood on the deck with 43 other German women watching the Statue of Liberty emerge through the morning fog. She had expected to feel something seeing this symbol of American freedom while wearing the gray uniform of a captured auxiliary soldier. Instead, she felt only numbness. They had been captured in France during the final chaotic weeks of the German retreat. Mechthild had served as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, believing she was helping defend her homeland from invasion. The moment American soldiers surrounded their communications post near Strasbourg, she understood that everything she had been told about winning the war was a lie. The other women pressed against the ship's railing, their faces reflecting the same confusion and fear that Mechthild felt. 21-year-old Adelheid Krauss, a former nurse from Dusseldorf, clutched a small photograph of her parents. 25-year-old Frida Lehmann, who had worked in military administration in Bremen, kept her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could somehow see all the way back to Germany. 24-year-old Roswitha Schneider from Hanover, A communications specialist like Mechthild stood with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, despite the wool coat she wore. American military police processed them through a facility on Ellis Island with efficient indifference. They were photographed, documented, and given identification numbers. Mechthild became prisoner 273. The reduction of her identity to 3 digits felt appropriate somehow. She no longer knew who she was supposed to be. The train journey from New York to Pennsylvania took most of the day. The women sat in a specially designated car, guarded by 4 American soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave. Through the windows, Mechthild watched America pass by. Cities that showed no signs of bombing, towns with intact buildings and working streetlights, farms where cattle grazed in peaceful fields. Everything looked impossibly clean and undamaged, nothing like the ruins she had seen across Europe. Adelheid noticed it too. "How is this possible?" she whispered in German. "We were told America was suffering, that they were rationing everything, that their people were starving." Mechthild had no answer. The propaganda they had been fed now seemed laughable compared to what she was seeing, but accepting that meant accepting that everything else they had been told might also be lies. That thought was too overwhelming to face. They arrived at Camp Harrison after dark. The facility sat in a valley surrounded by bare winter trees. Floodlights illuminated high fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, their searchlights sweeping across the compound in regular patterns. Captain Helen Waverly met them at the gate. She was a tall woman in her mid-30s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her uniform was crisp, her posture military precise. But her eyes held something Mechthild did not expect to see. Not cruelty or hatred, but a kind of weary compassion. Mechthild's first thoughts upon entering Camp Harrison were shaped by years of carefully constructed lies. Since 1933, the German government had told her what to think about America. The messages had been consistent and relentless. Americans were weak, decadent people who cared only for money and pleasure. They were mongrels, a mixed race without true culture or discipline. Their soldiers were cowards, who would crumble when faced with superior German resolve. The propaganda films shown in schools and cinemas had depicted America as a nation in chaos. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Homeless men slept in gutters. Crime consumed their cities. The American military was portrayed as incompetent and poorly equipped, no match for German superiority. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every poster had reinforced these messages until they became as natural as breathing. Mechthild had believed it all. Why wouldn't she? Everyone she knew believed the same things. Her teachers, her parents, her friends, the radio announcers, the newspaper editors. When you hear the same story from every possible source, doubt becomes impossible. The human mind cannot sustain constant skepticism against unanimous voices. She remembered the day she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943. She was 21 years old, proud to serve her country, convinced she was part of something noble and necessary. Her father had fought in the First War and spoke of duty and sacrifice. Her mother had sewn her uniform with trembling hands, tears of pride streaming down her face. The training had been rigorous but purposeful. Mechthild learned radio operation, code procedures, and military protocols. She was good at her work, precise and reliable. Her superiors praised her attention to detail. She felt useful, important, part of Germany's defensive shield against enemies who wanted to destroy everything she loved. But even during training, there were moments when small cracks appeared in the propaganda's smooth surface. An officer who drank too much and muttered about impossible orders. A letter from the front that described casualties far higher than newspapers reported. News of cities bombed, friends killed, resources growing scarcer. Yet each doubt was quickly explained away, smoothed over, reframed as temporary setbacks on the path to inevitable victory. The collapse came suddenly. One day she was at her radio post in France, sending encrypted messages. confident in German strength. The next day, American troops were surrounding her position, their weapons raised, their faces showing not the weakness propaganda had promised, but determined competence. She had expected them to shoot prisoners on sight. Instead, they offered water and checked for injuries. That contradiction had shaken something fundamental in her understanding. If they were wrong about American soldiers, what else were they wrong about? But accepting that question meant accepting that her entire worldview might be built on lies, that she might have served a cause that was not just losing, but fundamentally wrong. That possibility was too terrifying to fully examine, so she had pushed it away, focusing instead on simple survival. The barracks at Camp Harrison were wooden structures with thin walls and small windows. Each building housed 22 women in rows of narrow bunks. The mattresses were thin but clean. Wool blankets were folded at the foot of each bed. A single stove sat in the center of the room, its chimney pipe extending through the roof. Captain Helen Waverly walked them through the facility on their first evening, explaining rules and routines in clear, simple English that most of the women struggled to understand. Mechthild, who had studied some English in school, translated when she could. Daily roll call at 7 in the morning, work assignments at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, lights out at 10. The camp held only women prisoners, unusual in a war where most captives were men. The American military seemed uncertain how to handle them. Female guards were scarce, so male soldiers supervised most activities while maintaining careful distance. The awkwardness was evident on both sides. Sergeant Russell Thorne, a solid man in his 40s from Iowa, oversaw work details. He had kind eyes and a patient manner that seemed at odds with his military uniform. He spoke slowly, using simple words and hand gestures to communicate. When the women did not understand, he never showed frustration, just tried different approaches until meaning became clear. The work was not difficult. Kitchen duties, laundry, general cleaning, and maintenance. Nothing like the hard labor Mechthild had feared. The Americans seemed more interested in keeping them occupied than extracting useful work. Several guards appeared almost apologetic about the entire situation, as if they were embarrassed to be holding women prisoner. The food was plain but adequate. Bread, soup, occasionally meat or cheese. Portions were small but regular. No one was starving, though no one felt satisfied either. The meals were eaten in silence, the women keeping to themselves, speaking only in whispered German when necessary. Adelheid cried every night for the first week, quiet tears that she tried to hide beneath her blanket. Mechthild wanted to comfort her, but had no comfort to offer. They were enemies in a foreign land, thousands of miles from home, with no idea when or if they would return. Frida Lehmann dealt with captivity by withdrawing completely. She followed orders mechanically, spoke only when directly addressed, and spent free time staring at the wall above her bunk. Her face showed no emotion, as if she had decided that feeling anything was too dangerous. Roswitha Schneider wrote letters that would never be sent. She filled page after page with words for her family, describing her days, asking questions that would receive no answers. The act of writing seemed to keep her connected to something real, even if the connection was only imaginary. Mechthild observed everything with careful attention. She watched how the guards behaved, how the camp operated, searching for patterns that might explain what would happen to them. But the Americans remained confusing. Not cruel, not kind, just professionally distant. They provided what the Geneva Convention required and nothing more. Winter settled over Camp Harrison with bitter cold that seeped through the thin barracks walls. The single stove in each building provided minimal warmth. The women slept in their uniforms beneath wool blankets, still shivering through the nights. Morning frost formed on the inside of windows. Water in the washing basins froze solid by dawn. The cold was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, a numbness that had nothing to do with temperature. The women moved through their days like ghosts, performing assigned tasks without thought or feeling. They had become automatons, following orders because orders were all they had left. Mechthild noticed how the other prisoners had stopped talking unless necessary. Conversations required energy they did not possess. Even Adelheid, who had cried so much during the first weeks, now simply stared with empty eyes. The tears had run out, leaving only hollow acceptance. The American guards maintained professional distance. They were not unkind, but neither did they show warmth. Orders were given clearly. Work was supervised efficiently. Problems were addressed immediately, but there was no personal connection, no recognition of the prisoners as individuals rather than responsibilities to be managed. Captain Waverley made daily rounds through the compound, clipboard in hand, checking that regulations were followed and needs were met. She spoke to the women only about practical matters. Was anyone sick? Were supplies adequate? Did they understand their work assignments? Her questions were administrative, not personal. She never asked how they felt or what they thought. This coldness felt appropriate to Mechthild. They were enemies after all. Why should Americans care about their emotional state? The correct distance was being maintained. Rules were being followed. That should be enough. Yet something inside her felt disappointed by the lack of human connection, a feeling she tried to suppress because it made no sense. The days blurred together into monotonous repetition. Morning roll call in the freezing darkness, breakfast of thin oatmeal and weak coffee. Work details, scrubbing floors or washing dishes or mending torn uniforms, lunch of bread and soup, more work through the afternoon, dinner of whatever the kitchen prepared, evening hours spent in silence until lights out. Mechthild had expected captivity to be harsh, perhaps even brutal. What she had not expected was this dull, grinding emptiness. There was nothing to anticipate, nothing to hope for, nothing to plan toward. Just endless days of the same meaningless routine stretching forward into an unknowable future. Some women began to fade in ways that worried even the American medical staff. They ate less, slept more, spoke hardly at all. Dr. Patterson, the camp physician, examined them and found nothing physically wrong, but something was clearly breaking inside these prisoners, something that medicine could not address. By late February, the atmosphere in Camp Harrison had become suffocating despite the open sky above. Private Alvin Hoffmeyer had grown up on a dairy farm outside Madison, Wisconsin. He was 20 years old, with sandy hair that refused to stay neat under his cap, and hands that still bore calluses from milking cows before dawn. The Army had assigned him to guard duty at Camp Harrison, and he approached the work with the same quiet diligence he had brought to farm chores. Unlike some of the other guards, Alvin did not see the German women as enemies. He saw people who looked tired and sad and very far from home. It reminded him of how he felt during basic training, homesick and uncertain, wondering if he would ever see his family's farm again. One evening in late February, Alvin noticed Adelheid Krauss sitting alone near the barracks, her thin frame shaking with violent coughs. She had been sick for several days, but the cough was getting worse. He watched her press a hand against her chest, struggling for breath, her face pale even in the dim light. Without thinking about regulations or proper procedures, Alvin walked to the guard station and retrieved the wool scarf his mother had knitted for him. It was thick and warm, made from yarn she had dyed herself using walnut hulls. She had sent it in a care package with cookies and a letter reminding him to stay warm. He approached Adelheid slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with frightened eyes, uncertain what this American soldier wanted. Alvin held out the scarf and gestured toward her throat. She stared at the offered gift with complete confusion. "For the cold," he said in his limited German, words he had been learning from a phrase book. "Warm. You need warm." Adelheid did not reach for the scarf. Instead, tears began streaming down her face. She shook her head, trying to refuse, but Alvin gently draped it around her neck anyway. The wool was soft against her skin, and the gesture was so unexpected, so inexplicably kind, that something broke inside her careful control. "Why," she whispered in German, "why are you kind to me?" Alvin did not understand all her words, but he understood her tone. He shrugged with the self-consciousness of someone not used to explaining feelings. "My sister," he said, pointing to Adelheid, and then gesturing to indicate someone far away. "Same age. I think if she was here, someone should be kind." The next morning, Mechthild noticed Adelheid wearing the American scarf. Other women noticed too. Whispered questions spread through the barracks. Where did she get it? Why would a guard give her his own clothing? What did he want in return? But as days passed and Alvin asked for nothing, expected nothing, the women began to reconsider their assumptions. Perhaps kindness could exist without ulterior motive. Perhaps their enemies were more complicated than propaganda had taught them. Perhaps the coldness of captivity was not inevitable, but a choice that could be changed by simple human decency. March 17th arrived with unusual activity throughout Camp Harrison. The women noticed changes during morning roll call. Guards who normally looked tired and bored now moved with purpose. Sergeant Thorne wore a slight smile as he checked attendance. Even Captain Waverly seemed less stern than usual, her clipboard held more loosely than normal. After roll call, instead of proceeding directly to work assignments, the women were told to wait. Captain Waverly stood before them. Her posture military straight, but her expression almost gentle. She spoke in clear English while Mechthild translated. "Today is Saturday. In America, Saturday breakfast is special. We have decided that you should experience an American Saturday morning." She paused, then added something that surprised everyone. "We believe you have been here long enough to be treated with more hospitality than prisoners usually receive. You are still prisoners, but you are also human beings. Today we want you to remember that." The women were led to the mess hall, which had been transformed. Tables were arranged differently with proper spacing between them. The usual metal trays had been replaced with actual plates. Cloth napkins sat folded beside each setting. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed, and someone had opened the windows to let in fresh morning air. But it was the smells that made several women stop in their tracks. Rich, sweet, buttery aromas filled the space. The scent of coffee, real coffee, not the weak substitute they had been drinking. Something else, too, something many of them had not smelled in years. Fresh bread, bacon, butter melting on something hot. Private Hoffmeyer and 3 other guards had stood behind a serving line, wearing aprons over their uniforms. Behind them sat large pans of food, steam rising in clouds. Stacks of golden brown circles covered several platters, bowls of what looked like fruit, pitchers of juice, a ceramic container that could only be butter, glass bottles filled with dark amber liquid. "Pancakes," Captain Waverly announced, "an American Saturday tradition, with maple syrup, butter, eggs, bacon, and orange juice. Please, form a line." The women stood frozen. Mechthild felt her throat tighten. Pancakes. She had not seen pancakes since before the war, when her grandmother made them on special occasions. But these were not thin, sparse pancakes stretched to feed many mouths. These were thick, fluffy, abundant beyond imagining. Adelheid was first in line. Private Hoffmeyer smiled at her and placed 3 large pancakes on her plate. 3. Not one rationed portion, but 3 generous pieces. He added 2 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, and gestured toward the butter and syrup. "As much as you want," he said in careful German. Adelheid stared at her plate, then at Hoffmeyer, then back at her plate. Her hands began shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Adelheid carried her plate to the nearest table with trembling hands. She set it down carefully, as if the food might disappear if handled roughly. The 3 pancakes sat stacked perfectly, butter melting down their sides, bacon strips arranged neatly, eggs cooked with yolks still soft. A small bowl of strawberries she had not even noticed being added. She picked up the bottle of maple syrup. The dark amber liquid poured slowly, pooling on top of the pancakes before cascading down the sides. The sweet smell intensified, mixing with the butter and bacon. It was too much, too beautiful, too abundant, too kind. Adelaide's vision blurred. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed both hands over her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Around her, other women were receiving their plates, and the same scene repeated at table after table. Grown women, soldiers who had survived war and capture, weeping over breakfast. Mechthild stood in line watching this unprecedented display of emotion. When her turn came, Private Hoffmeyer met her eyes with gentle understanding. He loaded her plate with the same generosity, 4 pancakes instead of 3, extra bacon, a larger portion of eggs, as if abundance was the point, as if showing them plenty was more important than following any rationing rules. She carried her plate to where Frida and Roswitha already sat, both staring at their food with expressions of complete disbelief. Frida, who had barely shown emotion in months, had tears streaming silently down her face. Roswitha held her fork but seemed unable to actually use it. "How is this possible?" Roswitha whispered in German. "We were told America was starving, that they had nothing, that their people were suffering worse than ours." Mechthild had no answer. The evidence before them contradicted years of propaganda so completely that accepting it required abandoning everything they had been taught. If this was what prisoners received, what did ordinary American families eat? If guards could serve such abundance on a random Saturday morning, what did that say about American resources? She cut into her pancakes. The fork slid through easily, revealing fluffy interior texture. She brought the first bite to her mouth. The sweetness of maple syrup, the richness of butter, the soft warmth of perfectly cooked pancake. Flavors she had forgotten existed. Her throat tightened, and tears came despite her efforts to maintain composure. Around the mess hall, 44 German women sat crying over their breakfast, not from sadness or pain, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of experiencing kindness and abundance from people they had been taught to see as cruel enemies. The propaganda had prepared them for brutality. It had prepared them for deprivation. It had not prepared them for this simple, devastating generosity. Captain Waverley stood near the door, watching the scene with an expression that mixed satisfaction and sadness. She understood what was happening. These women were not just eating breakfast. They were confronting the collapse of their entire worldview, one bite at a time. Sergeant Thorne moved between tables, refilling coffee cups, offering more food, speaking quietly to women who seemed overwhelmed. Mechthild forced herself to eat slowly, to experience each bite fully. The pancakes were unlike anything she remembered from Germany. Light, almost fluffy, with a subtle sweetness even before syrup was added. The maple syrup itself was revelation. Not the thin, artificial substitute she had known, but rich, complex, with depth of flavor that seemed impossible for something so simple. The bacon was crispy, salty, substantial. Not the thin ration strips Germany had provided even before the war intensified, but thick cuts that actually tasted like meat. The eggs were cooked perfectly, yolks still runny, whites fully set. Even the butter was different. Creamy, fresh, abundant enough to spread thickly without worrying about rationing. But it was the fruit that truly shattered her understanding. Fresh strawberries in March. In Germany, fresh fruit had disappeared from markets years ago. Even before capture, Mechthild had not seen strawberries since childhood summers. Yet here they were, bright red, sweet, served casually as if they were common rather than precious. She watched Adelheid eat with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every sensation. The younger woman had stopped crying, but her face still glistened with tears. She chewed slowly, deliberately, her eyes closed as if to focus completely on taste and texture. "My mother used to make pancakes on Sundays Adelheid said softly in German, "before the war, but never like this, Never with real butter, never with this much syrup. We made them with water when eggs became scarce. We used beet syrup because sugar was rationed. Frida finally spoke, her voice rough from months of silence. I worked in food distribution for the Wehrmacht. Processed rationing reports, allocation requests, supply inventories. The numbers were classified, but I saw them. I knew how little food we had, how much we were importing from occupied territories, how the supplies were shrinking. She paused, looking at her plate with something like anger. We were told America was suffering worse, that they were begging for peace because their people were starving. But this, she gestured at the abundant breakfast, this is what they feed prisoners. Prisoners, what do they feed their own families? Roswitha had been eating mechanically, but now she stopped. Everything was a lie. Her voice carried no emotion, just flat statement of fact. Every radio broadcast, every newspaper, every poster, every speech, all lies. They told us America was weak, desperate, failing. But look at this food, look at this building, look at the guards' uniforms, their equipment, their health. Mechthild understood what Roswitha was processing. If the propaganda about what American poverty was false, what else was false? If they had lied about this, what else had they lied about? The questions opened doors to thoughts too dangerous to fully examine. Private Hoffmeyer approached their table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Private Hoffmeyer refilled their coffee cups with careful attention, his young face showing concentration. The coffee was hot, strong, real, not the chicory substitute or grain coffee that had replaced real beans in Germany years ago. Mechthild wrapped her hands around the warm cup, inhaling the rich aroma. "More pancakes?" Hoffmeyer asked in his careful, accented German. He gestured toward the serving line, where platters still held abundant food. The invitation seemed genuine, not performative, as if there was truly more available, as if shortage was not a concern. Adelheid shook her head, unable to speak. Her plate was only half empty, but she looked overwhelmed by what she had already consumed. Hoffmeyer nodded with understanding and moved to the next table, offering refills and seconds to women who seemed equally stunned by the abundance. Mechthild forced herself to finish eating. Wasting food felt wrong even in these circumstances. Each bite required conscious effort as her stomach, accustomed to smaller portions, protested the unusual fullness. Around the mess hall, other women faced the same struggle. Bodies trained by years of scarcity could not easily accept sudden plenty. Captain Waverley stood and addressed the room in English, with Mechthild translating. "I know this breakfast is different from what you have received. I want you to understand something important. This is how American families eat on Saturday mornings. Not wealthy families, not special occasions, ordinary working families, farmers, factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers. This is normal for us." The words landed like physical blows. Normal. This abundance that felt almost obscene was considered ordinary in America. The implication was staggering. If prisoners received what regular Americans ate, then the disparity between what they had been told and reality was even larger than the food itself suggested. "I know you were told many things about America," Captain Waverley continued, "that we were starving, that our economy had collapsed, that our people were suffering. I understand that you believed these things because you were given no reason to doubt them. But now you have seen the truth. Now you must decide what that truth means for everything else you were told." Her words hung in the air. Several women looked down at their plates, unable to meet her eyes. Others stared at the captain with expressions mixing anger and confusion. Being lied to was one thing. Having those lies exposed so definitively was another. It forced confrontation with uncomfortable questions about what else might be false. Mechthild thought about the radio broadcasts she had heard during training, reports of American defeats, American casualties, American desperation, stories of riots in American cities, of factories shutting down, of a nation on the brink of collapse, all presented as facts supported by official sources, confirmed by authorities she had trusted. But if America was truly failing, How could they feed prisoners this well? 2 weeks after the pancake breakfast, letters began arriving from Germany. The International Red Cross had finally established reliable mail routes through the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Captain Waverly distributed the envelopes during evening roll call, calling names in careful pronunciation. Some women received letters, most did not. Mechthild was among those who received nothing. She watched as Adelheid tore open an envelope with shaking hands, her face shifting from hope to devastation as she read. Across the compound, similar scenes played out. Women reading, then crumpling to the ground. Others standing frozen, letters dangling from numb fingers. That night in the barracks, those who had received mail shared what they had learned. The news was uniformly terrible. Adelheid's letter came from a neighbor, not family. Her parents were dead, killed when Allied bombers hit Dusseldorf in October. Her younger brother was missing, last seen during the retreat from France. The neighbor wrote that their entire street was rubble, that most families they knew were scattered or dead. Frida's letter described Bremen as a city of ghosts. Her sister wrote that their apartment building no longer existed, that food was scarce even for those with ration cards, that women and children were starving, while men who could fight were forced into last-ditch defensive units. The letter ended with a desperate plea for Frida to somehow send food, money, anything that might help. Roswitha received 2 letters. The first from a cousin reported that Hanover was 70% destroyed. The second, from a former neighbor, explained that Roswitha's mother had died of pneumonia during the brutal winter, and her father had been killed on the Eastern Front months earlier. The house Roswitha had grown up in was now occupied by refugees from the East, desperate families fleeing the Soviet advance. Other women shared similar stories. Cities bombed into ruins, families dead or scattered, homes destroyed, food shortages approaching famine levels. Germany was not just losing the war. It was being systematically devastated, reduced to rubble and desperation. The country they had served no longer existed in any recognizable form. Mechthild listened to these accounts with growing dread. Her own family was in Nuremberg. No letter meant she knew nothing about their fate. Were they alive? Dead? Homeless? Starving? The uncertainty was torture, but part of her feared that knowing might be worse. The women who had not received letters faced their own anguish. Did silence mean their families were dead, or did it simply mean mail had not gotten through? Was it better to know terrible news or to exist in perpetual uncertainty? That night the barracks filled with sounds of weeping. Women who had maintained composure through months of captivity now broke down completely. They cried for their lost families, their destroyed homes, their ruined country. They cried for the future that no longer existed, for the lives they would never return to. Adelheid curled in her bunk, still wearing the scarf Private Hoffmeyer had given her, sobbing with a grief that seemed to have no bottom. Mechthild sat beside her, offering silent presence because words were useless against such loss. Captain Waverly made rounds through the barracks, her face tight with compassion. She said nothing, just moved from bunk to bunk, her hand briefly touching shoulders, her presence acknowledging their pain without trying to diminish it. In the days following the letters, American newspapers began arriving at the camp with increasing frequency. Captain Waverly made them available in the common room, no longer restricting access to information. She seemed to believe the women deserved to know the full truth about what was happening to their homeland. The newspapers carried stories that contradicted everything the women had been taught about German strength and righteousness. Reports of concentration camps being discovered as Allied forces advanced. Photographs of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers designed for efficient murder. Detailed accounts from American soldiers describing what they found at places called Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Mechthild sat in the common room, forcing herself to read these accounts even as her stomach turned. The descriptions were specific, documented, supported by photographs that could not be dismissed as propaganda. Thousands of people deliberately starved, worked to death, or systematically murdered. Not soldiers, not combatants, but civilians selected for elimination based on religion, ethnicity, political beliefs, or simple inconvenience. Other women gathered around the newspapers, reading in horrified silence. Some rejected the reports immediately, insisting they were Allied lies designed to justify their destruction of German cities. But others, including Mechthild, found the accounts too detailed, too consistent, too thoroughly documented to dismiss. "I worked in administration," Frida said quietly, her voice hollow. "I processed transfer orders, supply requisitions, personnel assignments. I saw references to camps, special camps, labor camps. But the paperwork was always vague, classified. I never asked questions because asking questions was dangerous." She stared at a photograph of emaciated prisoners standing behind barbed wire. "I told myself I was just doing my job, following orders, supporting the war effort. But what if my paperwork helped this happen? What if I was part of this?" Roswitha picked up another newspaper, reading about systematic deportations, about trains packed with people sent to these camps. "We saw the trains sometimes, boxcars filled with people. We were told they were being relocated for work assignments. I remember wondering why they needed so many guards if it was just relocation. But I did not ask. None of us asked." Adelheid spoke through tears. "In Dusseldorf, there was a Jewish family in our building, the Goldsteins. They disappeared one night in '42. We heard the trucks, the shouting, but we stayed in our apartments. The next morning, their door was sealed. Within a week, new tenants moved in. We never asked what happened. We told ourselves they had been relocated. We needed to believe that." The women sat in the common room confronting the possibility that they had served a regime not just militarily aggressive, but fundamentally evil. That their work, however minor or administrative, had supported systematic murder on an unimaginable scale. That their silence, their willingness to not ask questions, had made them complicit. April 15, 1945. Germany's surrender was imminent. Everyone knew it. The newspapers reported Allied forces advancing from all directions, German resistance collapsing, cities falling without significant fighting. The end was not days away, but hours. Captain Waverley called an assembly in the mess hall. The 44 German women gathered with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Repatriation procedures would begin soon. They would be returned to Germany, to whatever remained of their homes and families. Freedom was approaching, yet many faces showed more fear than relief. The captain stood before them, her military bearing softened by months of interaction that had transformed prisoners into something more complicated. She held official documents but seemed reluctant to begin. When she finally spoke, her voice carried unusual gentleness. "Germany will surrender within days, perhaps hours. When that happens, you will no longer be prisoners of war, but displaced, persons awaiting repatriation. The process will take time. Transportation must be arranged, camps prepared in Europe, procedures followed. You will likely remain here for several more weeks before being sent home." She paused, looking at faces that had become familiar. "I want you to understand something. You are not our enemies anymore. The war is ending. What happens now depends on choices we all make about the future." Mechthild translated, her voice steady despite internal turmoil. Around her, women listened with expressions ranging from hope to despair. What did returning home mean when home no longer existed? What did freedom mean when everything familiar had been destroyed? That evening, Mechthild, Adelheid, Frida, and Roswitha sat together in the barracks discussing their uncertain futures. For the first time in months, they spoke openly about their fears, their doubts, their complete lack of clarity about what they wanted. "I have no family left," Adelheid said quietly. "My parents are dead. My brother is missing. The house I grew up in is rubble. What am I returning to? A destroyed city where I know no one?" Frida stared at the ceiling. "My sister's letter begged for help I cannot provide. She is starving in Bremen while I eat 3 meals daily here. How can I return and face her? What will I tell her about where I have been, what I have learned?" Roswitha spoke with surprising firmness. "I am not the same person who was captured. That person believed in the Reich, trusted the government, accepted everything she was told. That person no longer exists. The woman I am now does not belong in Germany. Mechthild had been thinking similar thoughts, but had been afraid to voice them. What if we did not return immediately? What if we requested to stay here, at least temporarily, until we understand better what kind of Germany we would be returning to? The suggestion hung in the air like something dangerous and forbidden. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across America. In Camp Harrison, the atmosphere was subdued. American guards celebrated quietly, aware that their German prisoners faced not liberation, but uncertainty about returning to a devastated homeland. Captain Waverly called another assembly. Official repatriation orders had arrived from Washington. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in France before being released to make their way back to whatever remained of their homes. Mechthild stood among the gathered women, her heart pounding with a decision she had spent days debating. Beside her, Adelheid, Frida, and Roswitha wore similar expressions of nervous determination. They had talked for hours, weighing impossible choices, and had reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and inevitable. When Captain Waverly finished explaining the repatriation procedures, Mechthild raised her hand. The captain looked surprised, but nodded permission to speak. "Captain Waverly," Mechthild said in English that had improved dramatically over 5 months. "May I speak for some of us?" Permission granted. Mechthild took a deep breath. Around her, several other women stood, a silent show of unity. 12 women total, nearly a third of the prisoners. Their decision had been made collectively, discussed endlessly, examined from every angle. We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately. The words came out more firmly than she felt. We request permission to remain here, at least temporarily, until we better understand what kind of future awaits in our homeland. The silence that followed was absolute. American guards exchanged shocked glances. Captain Waverly's eyes widened with genuine surprise. Even the German women who had not joined the request stared with disbelief. Adelheid spoke next, her voice shaking but clear. "I have no family left in Germany. My city is destroyed. I do not know anyone there anymore. Here I have found kindness when I expected cruelty. I have learned that everything I believed about America was false. I am not ready to return to Germany and pretend none of this happened." Frida added her voice. "We understand this request is unusual. We know we are still technically prisoners, that repatriation is what the Geneva Convention requires. But we also know that the Germany we served was built on lies and committed terrible crimes. We need time to understand who we are now before we can face returning to who we were." Roswitha stepped forward. "Here, we have been treated with dignity even though we were enemies. We have seen abundance where we were told there was starvation. We have experienced mercy where we expected punishment. These months have changed us. We cannot simply return to Germany as if we are the same people who were captured." Captain Waverly looked genuinely stunned. In her entire military career, she had never encountered prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. She asked for clarification, and what followed was an emotional outpouring that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. Mechthild explained that many of them had no families to return to, no homes left standing, no clear future waiting in Germany. The announcement created immediate division among the prisoners. The 32 women who had not joined the request looked at those who had with expressions mixing incomprehension and something approaching betrayal. How could anyone choose to remain with their captors? How could they reject their homeland, even a devastated homeland? That evening in the barracks, tension crackled between the two groups. Women who had lived together for 5 months, who had shared hardship and uncertainty, now found themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. "You are abandoning Germany when she needs her people most," one woman said to Mechthild with quiet anger. "The country is in ruins. We should be returning to help rebuild, not running away to comfortable captivity with our enemies." Mechthild had no simple answer. The accusation stung because part of her agreed. Was her request driven by principle or cowardice? Was she truly seeking time to process her transformation, or was she simply afraid to face the consequences of Germany's actions? But Adelheid responded with surprising firmness. "What Germany needs is people who have learned that blind loyalty leads to catastrophe, people who have seen that enemies can become friends when both sides choose humanity over hatred. We are not abandoning Germany. We are trying to become better Germans by first becoming better people." The debate continued through the night, voices rising and falling in German as women argued about duty, identity, and the meaning of home. Those who had chosen repatriation felt that remaining with Americans was a betrayal of everything German. Those who had requested to stay believed that returning immediately without fully processing what they had learned would be a betrayal of their own transformation. Mrs. Lorraine Pendleton arrived at the camp the following day. She was a local church volunteer who had been visiting weekly for 2 months, teaching English and bringing books. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had won over even the most suspicious prisoners. Captain Waverley had contacted her about the situation, and Mrs. Pendleton came with a proposal. Her church community was willing to sponsor some of the women who wished to remain, providing housing and support while they transitioned from prisoners to immigrants. The offer was contingent on approval from military authorities, but she wanted the women to know that American civilians were willing to help. "I cannot imagine what you are facing," Mrs. Pendleton told the gathered women, through Mechthild's translation. "To have lost everything, to have learned that much of what you believed was false, to have to choose between a destroyed past and an uncertain future. But I want you to know that some Americans see you not as enemies, but as people who deserve a second chance." Her words affected even those who had chosen repatriation. Several women began reconsidering their decisions. If American civilians were willing to offer such support, perhaps remaining was not the cowardly choice it had seemed. Over the following week, the composition of both groups shifted. 2 women who had initially requested to stay changed their minds, deciding that duty to family outweighed personal transformation. 3 women who had originally chosen repatriation joined those requesting to remain, swayed by Mrs. Pendleton's offer and their own growing doubts about returning to devastated Germany. The final count settled at 13 women requesting to stay, 31 choosing repatriation. Both groups had valid reasons, both faced uncertain futures, and both deserved respect for their difficult choices. Captain Waverley worked tirelessly to secure approval for the unprecedented request. She wrote detailed reports to Washington explaining the situation, arguing that allowing these women to remain could serve American interests by demonstrating mercy and offering a model for reconciliation with former enemies. She called in favors, pressed contacts, and made the case that rigid adherence to repatriation procedures served no practical purpose when prisoners themselves were requesting alternatives. The response from Washington arrived on May 23rd. The War Department would permit the women to remain on a conditional basis. They would be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons seeking immigration status. They would need sponsors, employment, and permanent housing arrangements. The military would provide temporary support for 30 days, after which the women would be responsible for their own situations. The decision meant freedom, but also vulnerability. As prisoners, they had been guaranteed housing, food, and protection under the Geneva Convention. As displaced persons, they would have only what American charity provided. It was a more precarious existence, but it was also genuine choice rather than imposed circumstance. Mrs. Pendleton and her church community moved quickly to arrange sponsorships. Mechthild would live with the Pendleton family while seeking employment as a translator. Adelheid had been offered a position continuing her nursing training at a local hospital. Frida would work with a accounting firm that needed someone with administrative experience. Roswitha had found placement with a radio repair shop that valued her technical skills. The other 9 women received similar arrangements, matched with families and employers who had volunteered to help. The American community's response had been overwhelmingly positive, with more offers of support than women needing placement. The repatriation date for those returning to Germany was set for June 12th. The women who were staying would remain at Camp Harrison until their individual arrangements were finalized, probably within 2 weeks. The final days before separation were emotionally complex. Women who had shared captivity now faced completely divergent futures. Those returning to Germany felt both relieved to be going home and anxious about what they would find. Those staying felt hopeful about new possibilities, but guilty about not returning to help rebuild their homeland. On the evening before repatriation, both groups gathered for a final meal together. The women who remained at Camp Harrison transitioned to civilian life gradually over the following months. Mechthild moved in with the Pendleton family in late June, carrying everything she owned in a single canvas bag. The house was a modest 2-story structure on a tree-lined street, nothing grand but impossibly clean and well-maintained compared to the devastation she had seen in photographs of German cities. Mrs. Pendleton showed her to a small bedroom on the 2nd floor. Real furniture, clean sheets, a window overlooking a garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. Mechthild stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of it all. This was how ordinary Americans lived, not in luxury, but in comfortable sufficiency that seemed impossible after years of wartime scarcity. "This is your home now," Mrs. Pendleton said gently, "for as long as you need it." Mechthild found work as a translator for the State Department office in Philadelphia, helping process the thousands of displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Her ability to speak German, understand European bureaucracy, and bridge cultural gaps made her invaluable. The work was emotionally difficult, facing daily reminders of the devastation her country had caused, but it felt like a form of penance. She could not undo the past, but she could help people trying to build new futures. Adelheid threw herself into nursing training with fierce dedication. She worked longer hours than required, studied late into the night, and volunteered for the most difficult cases. Her supervising physician recognized both her skill and her underlying motivation. She was not just learning to heal bodies, but trying to heal her own guilt about the past. "You cannot save everyone," Dr. Patterson told her one evening after she had stayed late with a dying patient. "Medicine has limits." "I know," Adelheid replied quietly, "but I have to try. I have to do something good to balance against what my country did." Frida's transition was perhaps the most difficult. Working in accounting meant constant interaction with numbers that represented resources, supplies, and money. She could not look at inventory reports without remembering similar reports she had processed for the Wehrmacht, to documents that had supported a regime now revealed as monstrous. Some days the guilt was overwhelming, but gradually she found meaning in using her skills for different purposes. Helping businesses operate efficiently, ensuring workers were paid fairly, maintaining systems that served communities rather than war machines. The work was mundane, but its very ordinariness felt redemptive. Roswitha discovered unexpected talent for radio repair work, the precision required, the logical problem-solving, the satisfaction of making broken things work again, all appealed to her methodical mind. Her employer, Mr. Henderson, appreciated her careful attention to detail and gradually gave her more complex projects. The 13 women who had stayed maintained contact with each other, meeting monthly at Mrs. Pendleton's church. They needed these gatherings, needed to be with others who understood the complexity of their situation. They were building new lives in America, but they'd carried their German past with them always. They were not quite German anymore, but not quite American either. They existed in an uncomfortable middle space, belonging fully to neither identity. Letters arrived sporadically from those who had returned to Germany. The news was consistently difficult. 25 years later, on a Saturday morning in April 1970, Mechthild Zimmerman Pendleton stood in her kitchen in suburban Philadelphia, making pancakes for her 3 children. Her oldest daughter, Helen, named after Captain Waverly, was setting the table. Her twin sons, Thomas and Robert, were arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to pour the syrup. Mechthild flipped the pancakes with practiced ease, watching their golden surfaces bubble and brown. She had made this breakfast hundreds of times over the years, but she never forgot the first time she had seen pancakes served at Camp Harrison. That morning had changed everything, had cracked open her worldview, and forced her to confront truths she had been avoiding. Her husband, Daniel Pendleton, Mrs. Pendleton's son, who had returned from the Pacific Theater in 1946, entered the kitchen and kissed her cheek. Their marriage had raised eyebrows initially, a German former prisoner marrying an American veteran, but over the years their relationship had become a symbol of the reconciliation both countries were working toward. "Mom," Helen said, "you're giving that faraway look again, the one you get when you're thinking about the war." Mechthild smiled. Her children knew her story, knew about her time as a prisoner, her decision to stay, her gradual transformation from enemy to immigrant to citizen. She had never hidden her past from them, believing that honesty about history was essential to preventing its repetition. "I was remembering the morning everything changed," she said. "The day American soldiers served us pancakes and taught us that enemies could become friends if both sides chose to be human first." She had remained in contact with the others who had stayed. Adelheid had never married, dedicating her life to nursing and eventually becoming director of nursing at a major hospital. Frida had married an American accountant and raised 4 children while building a successful consulting practice. Roswitha had opened her own electronics repair shop and become a respected businesswoman in her community. The 13 women had all built successful lives in America, but they had also maintained their connection to Germany. They sent money to help rebuild churches and schools. They sponsored German students studying in America. They worked with German-American friendship organizations. They had not abandoned their homeland. They had simply chosen to serve it differently than the regime they had once believed in. Mechthild had returned to Germany 3 times over the years. The country she found was transformed, rebuilt, not just physically, but morally. The new Germany had confronted its past, acknowledged its crimes, and committed itself to ensuring such atrocities could never happen again. She was proud of that transformation, proud that Germans had found the courage to face their history honestly. But she was also grateful for America, for the country that had shown her mercy when it could have shown cruelty, abundance when it could have given scarcity, and second chances when it could have demanded punishment. The pancake breakfast had been more than just food. It had been a demonstration of values, a lesson in how former enemies could choose reconciliation over revenge.